I'm going to start at 7:05 because there's still people coming in, and we've had over 200 people registering. So I'm just going to wait until 5:05. Welcome to those of you who are here. We are just waiting a little bit longer. Okay, I think we're going to start. So welcome everybody on behalf of the Communist Party to this webinar, what we call our Women's Equality Emergency, Policy Inclusion or Women's Exclusion. As I said before, 200 people have registered for this. Clearly not everybody's going to come, but there'll probably still be more to join us. This webinar will be live streamed and it will also be on Facebook. My name is Mary Davis. I'm the Secretary of the London Women's Advisory of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party is one of the very few organisations in the labour movement to have a far-reaching and well-founded analysis of women's oppression. And we therefore are very, very proud to host this very important meeting. We stand foursquare in the defence and extension of women's rights, which are now under sustained attack. We regard this as an emergency, hence the title of this talk. As I said, this is it's as Marxist feminists, communists reject any theory which privileges the ideological construct of gender over the material reality of sex. This is the third Women's Emergency meeting organised by the London Women's Advisory of the Communist Party, of which I'm Secretary. This meeting aims to highlight the extent to which gender-critical women are increasingly excluded from professional and political life, and how services for women are adversely affected by recent, I'd say, creeping policy shifts, but which are now very, very apparent. And whilst the Equality Act and case law offer some limited protection for women, the current policy mantra of what's called inclusion actually has circumvented the law and has in practice led to women's exclusion. And I think, I hope people will agree that this constitutes an emergency. I think that as communists, we have earned the right to participate in this debate because of the position, the very firm ideological and practical position that we take on this issue. It is a matter for the entire labour movement, and unfortunately, they need to wake up. Let's hope that meetings like this will help to stimulate not just the debate, but the understanding of the critical importance of women's rights and women's rights to and women's freedoms. So we have got a wonderful panel tonight to launch this meeting. Each speaker will have between 10 and 15 minutes to present their position, which will be followed by questions and comments, and then replies to the questions. Well, actually, questions rather than comments, to be honest. And they'll make their closing remarks at the end. We can extend the meeting till 9 o'clock if there are a lot of questions. Otherwise, we might finish at 8:30. But we'll see how the time goes. You will see at the bottom of your screen there is a facility for questions and answers. So please, please, please put your questions into the Q&A section, and hopefully all your questions will be answered to your great satisfaction. I'm sure they will, and I'm sure we'll be very, very pleased, and the panelists will be very pleased to answer them and engage in this, as I said, very important debate. I want to introduce the speakers, and I'll do them as I call them to speak. But just to say that there is one change in the listed speakers, and that is to say that Marion Calder from For Women Scotland has had a family emergency, and we're very pleased to, well, we're very sad about that, but we're very pleased to announce that her replacement is Marin Smith, and who stepped in at the very last moment. We're really grateful to Marin for I know she's going to speak brilliantly, so I'm very grateful that she's turned up and filled the breach. So our first speaker is Charlie Weinberg. Charlie is a member of the Communist Party. Charlie works in a field where the law, policy and practice are all subject to increasing monopoly and in danger of removing protections and exemptions legally provided. She will ask the question and hopefully answer who benefits from this, who is included, who is excluded, from what, and to what end. So it's a very great pleasure that I asked Charlie Weinberg to speak.
Hi, Mary, thanks. Hello, everyone. I probably won't answer that question at all. It made perfect sense when we thought about it as part of the title, but I haven't got the answers. I see my part in tonight's event really as a bit of a warm-up act, and what I hope to do is set a bit of context. Mary said correctly, I am a member of the Communist Party, and that is as a direct result of having attended an event where Mary, I think, was launching the Women's Charter, a pamphlet that I think Mary wrote and re-edits on a regular basis. And I went to an event where she was presenting it, bought it, available from the Communist Party Britain website, around £3.50. Highly recommend it. It happened to be what motivated me to join the party, but whether it has that effect on you or not, I think it's well worth a read, because it's a very accessible hop, skip and jump through the history of the women's movement. And I think one of the reasons that I was happy to join the party on the back of it, having never joined a political party in my life, is that for me, the most revolutionary act, or the revolution that is missing, is the prioritisation and promotion of women's rights. And if and when that happens, we might be able to think about revolution in process. I do quite a lot of public speaking, for good or for better or worse, but it never is as difficult as I have found preparing for this evening's event. And I think lots of reasons, but predominantly because I really found it made me kind of split bits of myself off in ways that I don't normally have to do. My professional life, my personal beliefs, values and attitudes, and my politics. Normally I find it much easier to weave those things together. And I think that's part of the reason why this event is so pertinent to me. I suppose in my mind, it became really clear to me as I was thinking about what I was going to say, that in my professional and working life over the last 30 years, it has always been kind of a bottom line expectation that I can articulate my commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-discriminatory practice. Where at the moment, I'm aware that making any explicit comment around my specific commitment to women's rights certainly wouldn't be either expected or well received necessarily. So firstly, I wanted to try and think a little bit about the conditions necessary for that to be the situation. How have we come to this? What is necessary in order for a climate in which upholding the legal and policy frameworks around the limited single-sex space that women have access to is dangerous, unpopular or contentious? And I'm aware that there are many people at this event who know a lot more about this than I do. There are historians and members of the women's movement that have much better knowledge than me, but this is my tiny potted trajectory that kind of occurred while I was thinking about what I wanted to say. And it's not a comprehensive, overarching list of names or countries or women involved. It's a very tiny snapshot. But I was thinking about the ways in which the impact of the women's movement globally is often vastly minimised and perhaps under-acknowledged by me, perhaps. So, for example, I was thinking about the impact that Greenham Common had, not only in the UK, but I think outside the UK, but certainly in terms of women's mobilisation and taking on of the arms trade, perhaps. Quite a phenomenal achievement. I think Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, Germaine Greer, Susie Albach, and their consistent articulations that connected sex-based oppression, the beauty and then exploitative industries, took those industries on and challenged prostitution, pornography, cosmetics and surgery, diets, fat and sexual desires as control mechanisms for women. That was happening in the 70s and the 80s. And then the collective mobilisation, largely, not only, but largely led by women around the illegal and abusive trials and rollout of both Depo-Provera and thalidomide, in turn took on and challenged the pharmaceutical industries in ways that perhaps we don't always hold present. And I don't think those things should be underestimated. The arms trade, the pharmaceutical industry, prostitution and pornography, all being consistently challenged by quite an active and well-known global movement of women, is a thing of great beauty. And I think perhaps brings me to my next point, which is about the importance of meaning and of naming things accurately. So it's a bit of a philosophical bit, this. It's not very long, I hope, but just the idea that for 30 years I've worked in what is called the voluntary sector or the charitable sector or the not-for-profit sector. And again, it dawned on me that the voluntary sector isn't run or led by volunteers, so that's not quite accurate. the charity sector isn't always based on a premise of individual benefactors bestowing their great surplus time and energy on poor people who need help, although sometimes it is, but it's not the most accurate description. And the not-for-profit sector certainly isn't not-for-profit. If you don't make a profit, you go out of business. Even charities have to generate a surplus because they have costs to pay. So none of those phrases are particularly accurate, the more I think about it. But we're not referred to either as the radical social change sector, which some of us might like to be, the supplement to government failures sector, or the additional statutory sector by another name, each of which might be slightly more appropriate or accurate. Particularly given the amount of work and income currently attached to government contracts delivered by charity, voluntary or not-for-profit sector organisations. And I will get back to that, but just one quick reference again to an international context, which is that in 2001, I went to work in Nicaragua, and my role was part of an international development agency under the gender strand that they ran across sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia and Latin America. Those strands were gender, education, poverty, I think it's actually poverty eradication, and HIV. And 3 years into my contract, gender was abolished. It was no longer a global priority for a development agency. Ta-da! It was, in fact, no more than a cross-cutting theme that we could assume to be inherent in any other priority of work that would be rolled out. And it was around that time, 2004-05, that the Nicaraguan feminist organisation I worked in began developing what would now be called a trans character in our award-winning social soap opera. That our male colleagues began receiving a significant increase in their invitations for international travel and conferences to discuss work around masculinities and men's experiences, men's health and men's environment. And it struck me that the abolition of gender as a priority theme, the evolution of a trans, non-binary character in a previously pretty sex-based and reproductive rights-based social soap opera, and the profile of our male counterparts starting to travel and talk about men's health, men's needs, was interesting. And so my fourth point, the context of contracts and legal and policy frameworks around women's limited rights and single-sex exemptions. And I just wanted to find a way to think about some really practical and pragmatic moments where these things come into my life, but play, I suppose. And I suppose I wanted to ask you all to consider what I'm about to say as a range of hypothetical situations that could occur, may have occurred, regularly occur across the fields of health, housing, domestic violence, drugs, women's, criminal justice, therapeutic and educational settings across England and Wales. And bearing in mind what you know of policy and legal frameworks, no matter how much or how little that is, because I think there will be a range of knowledge amongst over 100 people. But bear any of that and all of that knowledge in mind while Maya and Marin speak after me, and think about your response to 3 very short scenarios. 1, someone in a group you're working in, you're in a professional capacity and you're running a group, and someone says, but of course these days men can have babies too. To ignore it challenges your professional ethics and standards. To engage in and open up the debate perhaps leaves you open to accusations of transphobia from both participants and or staff. And to confirm it would be, to your mind, to lie, and runs in contra to your safeguarding and best practice policy and guidelines. second scenario, after a single sex group that you've been running, you get feedback from a colleague in a different organisation that a participant that they had referred found the single sex language exclusive and exclusionary, and that they would like assurances that your service would take this feedback on board. Your organisations operate under two separate and distinct policies and approaches, but your service is subcontracted to theirs in a high profile piece of work across a significant geographical area. And thirdly, you run a single sex parenting group, a trans identifying person is referred, and during a session, one participant asks if that person can relate to the issues in the group in the same way as the others due to their very different experiences of parenting. How do you support everyone in the group without colluding in a lie, causing offence, disrupting the issues from parenting, or on focusing on individual experiences or spotlighting someone? I hope some of that has been useful and set up some questions that I'm really hoping Maya and Marin, like genius, are going to be able to help us think about. And I can see we've already got questions and comments coming in. So, Mary, thanks very much. Back to you.
Well, thank you. And just a slight correction. So the book is Women and Class. The Charter for Women is the policy and campaigning aspect of it. Anyway, thank you very, very much. You've posed the crucial questions, and well, let's hope that in some way they're taken up, but if not, they are questions that are going to be set us for a long, long time. And our next speaker is Maya Forstater. Maya said to me that the most important thing that she's ever done is to lose her job because she engaged in public debate about gender self-identification. Actually, it's not the most important thing she's ever done. She's actually, and I'm sure she'll tell you about this, she's won a very important case which has got implications for all of us. And she was absolutely dogged and determined in the way that she pursued it. Maya is the co-founder of Sex Matters, and its mission, the mission of Sex Matters, is to establish that sex matters in rules, laws, policy, language, and culture. Maya is going to speak on the implications of her recent case, which was there to really protect the rights to openly believe, to quote, that sex is immutable and not to be conflated with gender identity. So Maya, I'm really pleased you're here. I know you do a lot of speaking and a lot. Yes, can contribute a lot to our understanding of this. I think you're going to look at the implications of your case and why it's important, and what does it mean for people in the working environment. I'm very pleased to welcome Maya Forstater. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Charlie, for inviting me. I thought those were really good dilemmas, and I hope we get a chance to answer them a bit. You did just spring them on us though, and not didn't give us any pre-warning of them, but I think they really illustrate the kinds of dilemmas that thousands of women, mainly women, but not only women, people in their professional life are facing, between what they can morally say, what they can in good conscience say themselves, what they can say in terms of the job that they have to do, and the often vulnerable people that they're safeguarding, or their responsibilities in terms of statistics or data or whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing well. How can they do that and step into somebody's fantasy? And then the question about what they can legally say and what they can say without losing their job. And I'm going to tell my story, which is my personal story, but I know since I launched the crowdfunder for my case, which was when I sort of went public about what happened to me, I've heard from hundreds of women, and some men, but mainly women, who faced similar things at work. So, you know, my story is kind of a tip of the iceberg, and it has hopefully changed the situation for other people. Yeah, it's interesting with COVID restrictions sort of going down a bit. I've been getting out a bit more and going to meetings, and I go to things, and I'm never sure when I meet people whether they know my story, whether they admire and support me, or whether they hate me. And you know, quite often I find that people haven't been following the story. You know, if you live on Twitter and you are part of these conversations, it can seem like this is something that's sort of looming in the front of everyone's mind, but quite often I talk to people and they have no idea what's happened. So I am going to sort of tell my story, which some of you will have heard and some of you won't, and then sort of go into the implications of it and answer questions. So apologies to people who've heard this story before. So it starts in 2018 for me, which was when the government was consulting on the Gender Recognition Act and asking people to feed into government consultation about whether it should change from people being able to change their sex with a doctor's, two doctors' diagnoses and evidence of living as the opposite sex, whatever that means, to a system of self-declaration without any medical gatekeeping. And I started paying attention to this in 2018, sort of seeing it on my Twitter feed, seeing it on Mumsnet, thinking, you know, this doesn't make sense. I had always thought that, you know, people should be free to live their life as they choose, that, you know, people should not be discriminated or harassed for being transsexual, but people can't change their sex. It never occurred to me that people would think that someone could change their sex, whether by saying words or changing their clothing, changing their lifestyle, or having operations. So, you know, I think like many people, that sort of dawned on me in 2018, and then also seeing the violence and the suppression of debate, and watching things like when Women's Place UK tried to have meetings and those meetings were shut down and there were violent protests, and just thinking I should speak up. I was working at a think tank, so I thought I had some safety and expectation in my job that I would be able to talk about issues where there are different views and where it's contentious, and so I thought I should. So I started to tweet about it, first tweeting very I mean, it took me about half a day to write the first 4 tweets. I was that nervous, and I tweeted sort of, the government is having a consultation, you should read this brochure by Fair Play for Women, I urge you to think about it and answer the questions, or something fairly bland, and got no responses to that, and then was sort of tweeting about things that were in the news, about Karen White, about who's the male prisoner who transitioned to live as a woman and was put in a women's prison and sexually assaulted female prisoners, you know, things that were making me incredibly angry that institutions could do this to vulnerable women. And I was tweeting them to 2,000 people that I had as followers at the time and getting nothing, no response at all. And so then I thought I would ask a direct question and then I might get some response from my followers. And so I asked about Pip Spunts, who is a banker who works for Credit Suisse and who is a married man called Philip, who sometimes goes to work as Pippa in a pink mini dress, as far as I could see on the pictures that made it into the Financial Times, and who won an award for being a woman in business. And so I tweeted a question about manels, so colleagues in the development sector, being right on. Male colleagues say they will not be on a panel in a conference if it's all men. They will ask for the place, can you find a woman who knows about this topic? And so I asked, if you're on a panel with 2 other men and Pip's Bunce, would you still say, can you find a woman? And I did this to sort of bring the question, make the question personal. And the question is personal for so many women, and it's obviously personal for vulnerable women, women who have the least amount of choice. It's the decision is made for them. Is a women's refuge going to allow men to self-identify in? Is it going to employ a CEO who's male, who identifies as a woman? But for many people who are not in those situations, they can think, well, it's a complex and difficult issue, and I don't really need to engage in it, and I can see the trouble people get if they do engage in it, so I'm not going to think about it. So I thought the Manel's question, it's sort of like Charlie's dilemmas, was like, when this comes to you in your work, where you've made a moral commitment to do something for women, do you get confused about what that commitment is when a man puts on a dress and says doesn't even say he's a woman, but just has a feminine identity for part of the week? And so I tweeted about it, and then there was a big debate on Twitter, which led to HR in my work paying attention and getting worried. And over the next 6 months, I lost my job, which was a kind of long and somewhat boring story, which I will tell in the tribunal. But it wasn't as straightforward as being given a P45, because I wasn't a full-time regular employee, but I do have rights protected under the Equality Act as a worker, and as a potentially as a someone seeking work, someone who's previously employed. There are a lot of categories of protection that go wider than just people with full-time contracts. So after I lost my job, which was in March 2019, I tweeted this, not thinking I had any employment rights at the time, because I was a consultant and it just didn't occur to me that I did. But I tweeted that I lost my job, and the feminist lawyers arrived, like the fairy godmother to Cinderella. And I didn't realize, but there were a group of feminist lawyers who'd already been thinking about my case, although not me, but thinking about this situation and looking for a good test case. And they had already thought about belief discrimination, that would be the way to protect women speaking up about this in the workplace. So they were looking for a good case, and I tweeted, and so they arrived. And so the case that we brought was that so the Equality Act protects you against discrimination on the grounds of disability, race, sex, pregnancy, trans status, I can't remember, I've missed some, but also religion or belief. And that means you shouldn't be discriminated against for having a religion, like being Catholic, being a Jew, but also being an atheist or being an ex-Muslim. So lack of belief is also protected. And it also protects philosophical beliefs that are not religious. But in order for your philosophical belief to be protected, it has to meet a series of tests, which basically say, this is a belief that is similar to a religion in that it's serious, it's important, it's central to your life, it's coherent. It's not just, it's not a belief that Arsenal is the best football team, although that probably also feels like a religion to some people. So it has this test of what is a protected belief. And there are 5 tests, and the 5th one is it worthy of respect in a democratic society and doesn't undermine other people's human rights or destroy other people's human rights? And so we went to tribunal. I went to tribunal to test whether my belief is protected under the Equality Act. Both my belief, which is the belief that sex is real, immutable, binary, and important, which is a strange thing to talk about as a belief, because if you talk to your grandma, that's just common sense. And if you talk to most people, it's just common sense. But in order for it to be protected, we had to frame it as a belief. But we also talked about lack of belief. So I don't share the belief of some people in gender identity ideology, in the idea that your inner feeling of being a man or a woman, or a man on Monday and a woman on Tuesday, or not, or neither, should override sex in society. So I know people have that belief. I don't share it. And it was really important, I think, taking this as a belief case, because it puts this, I think, in the right place, which is, in a plural society, we have people with all kinds of different beliefs who work together and live together and agree and disagree, and also agree to disagree. And we can do that, and we know how to do that. And so I think putting this into the belief space is the right place for it to be. So I had to launch crowdfunder to pay for the lawyers, which was I think the scariest thing I've ever done, because that was the moment I stepped out from being a private citizen to being kind of public property. Story in the newspaper, crowdfunder, and it took off better, than we could have expected. And it obviously just hit a seam of angry women, of frightened women, of people concerned with freedom of speech, people concerned with feminism, people concerned with child safeguarding, people who were afraid to speak up in their workplace and could see that I had done it and I paid the price. So I raised £60,000 in the first 3 days. And I felt much better after that, because I knew there were thousands of people behind me. So we went to court in November 2019, and I lost. So they asked me what I believe, and they asked me some really stupid questions. And the judgment came back in December saying that your belief that sex is real, immutable, and important is not worthy of respect in a democratic society, which means that it is on par with anti-Semitism, or being a Nazi, or wanting to overthrow the government by violent revolution. Those are the kinds of beliefs that are ruled out. And that was gutting for me, and for everybody. That was a low point. And the next day, J.K. Rowling tweeted, which was completely unexpected. I had no contact from her. Somebody WhatsApped me the tweet, and I thought that they'd photoshopped it to cheer me up or something, because we'd all been sort of watching J.K. Rowling liking things. There were signs that she was thinking about this, and I had wondered whether J.K. Rowling would make a move, but I never imagined that it would be me that sort of unlocked the J.K. Rowling badge. So she tweeted about my case, and that made it from being a UK thing to being an international story. So I was in Variety and the LA Times and the Australian papers, bigot, international, infamous bigot all over the world, which, was not something I'd planned to be in my life. Have I got a little bit longer? Okay. So lockdown, very boring. Finally got a court date for the appeal in April 2021, so very recently. Went back to court and argued that the original judgment was wrong. It was wrong in saying that my view, the view that I share with most people around the world and most people throughout history, which is a completely ordinary belief, was on par with Nazism. It was just a complete miscarriage of justice. And where the court had gone wrong was in trying to judge the manifestation of my belief, so what I had done and said, as as being core to the belief, and they'd done it in a way they hadn't. I've not yet had a chance to go into court and say what I did, what I tweeted, what I said, and for that to be tested, and that will be tested in the next round. But the judge sort of looked at the things that I'd put in the evidence, which were evidence of my belief, and picked things out to try and show that I must be a terrible person, and I must have said awful things, and I must have harmed people, in order to say that my belief was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So June 10th this year, new judgment. The belief is worthy of respect in a democratic society, which means that we are protected by the Equality Act against discrimination, harassment, and victimization for believing that sex is real and for not believing in gender identity ideology. And that covers people at work, in all kinds of work, not just very formal employment, people as customers of public services and of private businesses, including Twitter and Facebook and social media companies that are throwing people out of off their accounts, and as members of political parties and associations. So it covers all of that, and it covers harassment, so making people feel that they're in a hostile environment because of their belief. So I think it's powerful, and we're already seeing people getting their Twitter accounts back, people using the judgment to show to their employers to say, hold on a second, I have rights, I have freedom of belief, I have a degree of freedom of speech. You don't have absolute freedom of speech at work, but your employer can't have rules that create a detriment for people who have a particular belief or don't have a particular belief. So it's having an effect, which is amazing, and that's why it is the most important thing that I've done. And I will be going back to court in March 2022. So that's 3 years, almost to the day, from when I lost my job, to hear the rest of the case, which is how I lost my job, what happened, did my employer act reasonably, or did they act unreasonably? And they're going to say that they acted reasonably because they had to protect trans people and their values of inclusivity. So in order to be inclusive, they had to exclude me because my presence was so unsafe. And so the next part of the case is very fact specific. It's about me and my employer and what happened, but it's also very important because it's a proof of concept that these rights that we have don't just exist on paper, but that they really protect people in the workplace and that they can be used. So it's carrying on. And as Charlie did the little bit of promotion with the Sex Matters Cup, I have co-founded an organisation called Sex Matters, which is to help people to understand and use the law and speak up in their organisations, hold their organisations accountable, and to unpick gender self-ID that has been adopted into every big employer. It's a big job, and we think it needs an organisation, and we're just at the start of that. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end if I can.
Yes, oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Maya. That is brilliant, really brilliant. And the fight goes on, clearly. And I think I wouldn't be alone in this meeting in sharing the belief and actually the real knowledge that sex is real, binary and important. I wish we could all put our hands up to agree with that statement. I'm sure we all do. So our next speaker, by the way, just on the question of politics, this is hence the title of this meeting, this mantra of policy inclusion, and obviously in the case that Maya just mentioned, her own case, that mantra of inclusion, in fact, does mean women's exclusion. And I think our next speaker, Marin Smith, will be able to demonstrate that even to great effect because of the situation in Scotland. And just to remind you that Marin Smith is very, very kindly at the very last minute replaced Marion Calder. Marion is, and so thank you again. Marin is also a member of For Women Scotland, and she is also an activist in the Heal Survivors group in Scotland. This survivors group highlights the growing loss of single-sex provisions throughout Scotland, focusing on the impact this has on female survivors of abuse and rape. And these survivors are increasingly compelled to self-exclude in order to protect their well-being. Marin also campaigns to uphold the rights of children in our schools, highlighting where the rights of girls in particular are damaged by school policies based on gender self-identification. So very great pleasure, Marin, to welcome you, and over to you now.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for inviting me, even if it was at short notice. I will just start by saying that my talk is obviously going to be a little different in focus from what Marion would have talked about, but I will still give an overview of the situation in Scotland, and I will start by why should it matter to you if the Scottish Government passes the reform of the Gender Recognition Act to enshrine gender identity in law by making it a simple self-declaration issue. It is because, and I'm quoting here, Section 2 of the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill proposal, which we don't really have any reason to believe will be different next time round, as published for the consultation that closed last year, amends Section 8 A of the original Gender Recognition Act. And subsection 2 states that you can apply to self-declare your sex in Scotland if you either have a Scottish birth certificate or you are ordinarily resident in Scotland. Now, this phrase ordinarily resident doesn't have a definition in Scottish law, and it has never been defined by an Act of Parliament in UK law, but there is case law showing that this isn't really talking about somebody moving to Scotland and having to show that they've lived there for 5 years. No, case law says short duration is accepted. So if Scotland introduces self-ID, England, Wales and Northern Ireland will de facto have self-ID, because the Gender Recognition Act itself provides for the recognition of all gender recognition certificates issued in Scotland across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the problems we have with the introduction and adoption of self-identification into policies and regulations, which are very, very hard to address and will be much harder to address if self-ID is enshrined in law. So it's good that Liz Truss for the UK government has stated that the UK government will not reform the Gender Recognition Act in England and Wales. But that doesn't mean you will not have self-ID in England and Wales. And having said that, there is a real problem with the proposal in that there is no proof required of anything. So there is also no proof required for you to show you do actually really live in Scotland. It's very easy to just come up for a month, stay there, maybe have a couple letters sent to you and apply. I don't even know if you need the letters because, as I said, the law proposal does not include having to provide any proof of being ordinarily resident in Scotland. So I am just really quickly going to talk about the consultation, which closed in March, and 34 women's groups responded to this consultation. We had a previous consultation where we only had 20 women's groups, and this time we've had 19 women's groups just in Scotland, so 7 more than in the last consultation. This has had the effect of basically changing approval or disapproval, agreement or disagreement in the women's groups that the analysis looked at specifically. So now the women's groups, whether in Scotland or from the UK, are overwhelmingly against reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And the analysis report is actually really worth looking at. It is a good summary of a lot of the arguments made for and against reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And it lists a lot of objections from a lot of people, and surprisingly also objections coming from both sides of the debate to the same things in the Act, such as, for instance, there are no definitions of gender, acquired gender, or what it means to live in a gender. So women's groups have obviously criticized this language because it sounds very much like you are enshrining stereotypes, sex stereotypes and sexual stereotypes in law, because what does it mean to live in an acquired gender? Does that mean the Scottish government believes there's a right way to be a woman and a wrong way to be a woman? There's no definition, so we don't know. And the other side has criticized this language because they are asking the same question. What does it mean? What do we have to do to demonstrate we live in an acquired gender? Despite this agreement across very many of the issues raised by submissions to the consultation, the First Minister has recently said that our concerns are not valid, which, to be fair, is really, really, really difficult to hear when you are in the position that we are in as a survivors group who are struggling to be heard on the issue that we are facing, which is that we are increasingly compelled to self-exclude from services, which we need to be single sex, but that are publicly engaged in this debate, telling everybody that they are fully trans inclusive. Now, we don't use the word trans women. What we use is the word men with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. So what all of these services are telling us constantly, most recently on the 9th of August, Rape Crisis Scotland, in a statement, we are proudly women only, and this includes transgender women. Or in our language, we are proudly women only, and this includes men with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Now, all of the organizations in the women's in the violence against women and girls sector across the UK who have made trans inclusion statements like this have failed to make statements assuring female survivors who need a female only service that, of course, at point of delivery you will still receive the female only service you need. We haven't had that. Instead, what we have increasingly had are very ill-advised remarks from senior leadership of Rape Crisis, calling us bigoted, prejudiced, transphobes. And of course, it's really concerning when you are trying to speak as a survivor, because there's an additional barrier to speaking up as a survivor, because you are basically telling everybody, hi there, I'm Marin, I'm a survivor of sexual violence. That's not easy to do. And a lot of people aren't really in a position where they can go and give up their anonymity, because that has repercussions in your private life. Family members might not know about this. People will react very differently to you when you talk about this. And these are all things that are going on when you should really be focusing on your own recovery. Instead, we are trying to do this. So this is actually the very first time I'm talking publicly about this for our group, because we've spent 2 years agonizing over whether we should speak about this or not, and whether we should actually highlight the fact that female survivors are increasingly being excluded. However, very helpfully, very recently, the CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis has acknowledged that we are now talking about large groups of survivors who are, and I quote, not using our services because they see us as trans inclusive and feeling that they may be exposed to an issue that they are not prepared to deal with. Now, I will fill you in on what the issue is. The issue is that we are not prepared to deal with encountering men with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment in what we need to be a female-only therapeutic environment. Now, I'll very quickly tell you something about my story just to explain why we're not bigoted, we're not even man-hating, we're not prejudiced, we're also not transphobic. We are expressing a need we have identified, and a need that currently is either not being met by some rape crisis centres or publicly denied, but possibly when you do access the service, you can still have a female-only service. But it seems to be a little bit of a postcode lottery for us right now. So my story is that I went to my first ever women's rights meeting on Valentine's Day in 2018, having heard of this weird law that was being reformed and having heard that these people are really horrible people. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and see if they really are horrible and if they are hateful and if they are bigoted. And I found it was actually amazing. I've never been to a women's rights meeting before. I was very political, and the feeling of love in the room was just the most wonderful thing I ever experienced. 150 women talking about women's rights and women's needs. And there were a lot of things being discussed at that meeting. And amongst many other things, the problems that young women and girls, teenage girls, were having, coping with the environment they find themselves in, pornography, you know, sex workers' work, all of these kind of things. An endemic rise in violence in our schools, sexual violence, and in society. And it's not coupled with a rise in prosecutions, quite the contrary. And of course, all of these wonderful women were discussing this. And I actually sat on my hands because all I wanted was to jump up and say, you are not talking about the most important reason why a lot of these girls don't want to grow up to be women, and that's to get away from sexual violence at the hands of men. And I did. I went up front and I told my story. And I still wish I hadn't done it, because I didn't know what happens when you do that, is it all comes back. So 30 odd years after I was attacked as a 12-year-old, I developed PTSD. I didn't know what it was, didn't think you could have PTSD when you're not a soldier. And I was suddenly stuck because the service I'd used before, Rape Crisis Scotland, in particular the phone helpline, when I had a related but slightly different issue, was publicly saying, if you need, you know, to anybody who said women like me need a female-only service, they were publicly saying, no, we've been trans inclusive for years, we've never had a problem. And I'm thinking, well, I can't talk to a man. I need to talk to a woman. What do? I did nothing. And I'm sure very many of you can imagine what that did for me. It wasn't very good. So we reached out in 2019 to Rape Crisis to ask them if we could have the female-only service we needed, and if they could maybe stop denying that female survivors needed a female-only service. It didn't go well. It wasn't a good meeting. And it took us a very long time, but the group of us who went there have decided to start speaking publicly about this, because we need this. Well, actually, we need this to stop, and we need Charlie's dilemma. What do you do at work when you are in a rape crisis service and a woman comes and says, I need a female counsellor? What do you do? Do you say, well, you know, here's a Mary, and, oh, you know, Mary is a woman, even though Mary looks like a man? What do you do? Do you tell me it's a man and I'm right and I can have somebody else? Or do you tell me actually that's a woman and you're a bigot for even saying that? And unfortunately, Charlie's dilemma is actually happening across the violence against women and girls sector, and it isn't being answered to the benefit of women. And I think, is that time up?
You can carry on if you want to. This is really brilliant. Thank you, Marin. If you want to say more, please do.
I'll just say very quickly, I'll just say something about the hate crime bill. And where we have a problem is that For Women Scotland are currently engaged in an appeal to a ruling against them in a judicial review of a particular law that was supposed to remedy inequality that women suffer when it comes to public boards. Now, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not really involved with the case. I will just tell you something that emerged during the hearing. And that is that the Scottish Government disclosed that it had adopted a policy that transgender women are to be treated as non-transgender women unless to do so would be prohibited by law. Now, I'll translate that into our language. Women, men with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment are to be treated as women unless to do so would be prohibited by law. Now, this sounds, not terrible until you remember that we do not have any laws that prohibit you from treating them differently. The only thing we have is the Equality Act, which allows you to treat them differently. So when you have a government saying that they have a policy that they'll never treat them differently unless they're prohibited, and there is no law that prohibits them, how do you judge the statement that introducing self-ID via Gender Recognition Act reform will not have an impact on single-sex services, when the Scottish Government has already told you, in essence, they seem not to agree with single-sex services? And they have, in response to criticism they received from For Women Scotland on their funding requirements for the violence against women and girls sector, they actually changed the funding requirements. The funding requirements used to be that you have to show that you will include men with a protected characteristic of gender reassignment in your single-sex services. So they changed the requirements after criticism, and now they say you have to first show how you will include these men, but then you may exclude them, which is very confusing for organizations. And I don't blame them for not coming out with really clear statements. They have a real problem here. Is the Scottish Government saying, well, yes, you can exclude them, but we're not going to fund you? Or is the Scottish Government saying, well, first you have to show us how you will include them, then you can exclude them, but we're probably going to come back to you and say, well, you've shown you can include them, so why won't you include them? So it's really confusing. And what we would want from Rape Crisis, from Scottish Women's Aid, from every centre, is a statement sitting alongside trans inclusion statements saying, yes, we are trans inclusive. And yes, if you are a female survivor who needs a female-only therapeutic environment, that's what we will deliver. We're not asking for anybody to stop supporting men with a protected characteristic of gender reassignment. We would never do that. But we would like these services to say, yes, we will also support female survivors who need a female-only service.
Marin, thank you very, very much indeed. That was brave and brilliant. Thank you. I think all our panelists have just really been superb. And there's lots of questions, and I see that Maya has already bagged a couple of them that you want to answer. if this is correct. Question from, well, I can only say F. McDonald, about how policy capture in the trade union movement can be combated. The majority of women who work in public services gagged in the course of their work. Now they're gagged within many trade unions. Maya, do you want to answer that? Or at least is that correct?
I'll say a little bit.
Yes.
People are going to have to sue their trade unions. There will have to be cases of women suing their trade unions because they are not supporting women on this. I have heard from so many women. I wasn't in a union, but I've spoken to so many women who've been going through investigations at work over this and who have had lukewarm or no support from their union or active hostility. And I've spoke to employees of trade unions who've been bullied and harassed at work because of this. The only thing I can think is that there will have to be test cases of women suing their trade unions for not supporting them.
Thanks, Maya. And I think there's a question from Susan O asking whether the panel agrees that part of the problem is the catch-all phrase transgender rather than the language we used before to differentiate between transsexuals, transvestites and EGPs. I feel the general public thinks transgender equals transsexual. Does anybody want to have a go at that? I think Maya probably does, but maybe the others have some comments. Go on, Maya.
I thought Marin's language was really good. That language of men with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment it's legally correct and it's materially correct. And I think the protected characteristic of gender reassignment is really wide. It covers somebody who is thinking about transitioning. It covers somebody who's transitioning in any way whatsoever. It doesn't differentiate between AGP and transgender and transsexual. And I think in practice, you can't. It's impossible to do that. So I think what you have to do is describe the reality, which is these are men, they're all of them men. I mean, people who call themselves trans women, they're also women who are trans, and they may have different motivations and they may have different characteristics and they may have gone through different operations, but we can't ask them about that. It's none of our business. We can't judge it. We can't judge who is true or not. So all we can say is, as a group, these are men with this characteristic. And then I think if you do that and you think, well, what is this characteristic of being trans? And basically it's not wanting to have your sex acknowledged. That's all it is. That you can't put a criteria on it that says you have to dress in a certain way, you have to have operations, you have to have a diagnosis. Either those things have been shot down by human rights, or they're sexist, or they're impossible. But what you can say is, this is a person who does not want their sex to be acknowledged. And then that leads us to ask, well, in what situations is it legitimate and reasonable and practical not to acknowledge someone's sex? And in what situations is that not legitimate and reasonable? And I would argue that in any single sex service, once you've said that this is a single sex service, it's impossible to accommodate somebody in that service who doesn't want their sex acknowledged. But most parts of public life are not single sex. If you go to a restaurant, or you go to the cinema, or you go to the pub, people can treat you politely without making a thing about your sex. It's only when you're trying to access a single sex service that your sex is important, and there's a conflict between people who don't want their sex acknowledged and services that need to acknowledge people's sex. And I think so my answer is not that we try and narrow it down to the true trans and these people really do change sex. Is to say nobody changes sex. but they have a limited right to privacy, as everyone has a right to privacy, and in what situations and how can that privacy be protected without undermining women's rights and child safeguarding?
Mary, can I have a go?
Yes, I was going to ask you. Please do.
Well, just this is going to be hugely unpopular. I appreciate that, but I mean, given where we are and what we're doing, it's a bit late. Personally, I'd love to join a women's trade union that prioritises and promotes women's rights at work, and that puts that at the forefront of the trade union movement. Personally, I'd be all about it. I haven't ever set it up and I'm not going to, but if anybody else wants to, let me know, because I'm in. I just don't think the trade unions take women's employment needs, rights, conditions, labour specific circumstances seriously enough. Personally, I think this current situation is an extension of that. In terms of the language around transgender, transsexual, I agree. Marin, thank you so much. It's how come I never thought of it? Men with a protected characteristic, duh, that's it. And it does various things. It relocates the idea that a man with a protected characteristic is somehow vulnerable and therefore becomes a woman, or needs protection from some threat or insecurity and therefore must access women's services. It's a man. Where are the men's services taking care of men who have a protected characteristic? If there are men that need rape crisis services, the women's movement for many years, over a very long period of time, has been pivotal in supporting the development and the curation of those services. Well, let's continue that support, but actually they're men. These people are men. What's wrong with that? Men can suffer horrendous experiences. Doesn't mean they're women. And I think the other thing it does is remind us of the fact that this idea that gender is a performance and that queering the world and, you know, me putting on a dress means that although I've still got my man's salary and my man's rights and my man's experiences, if you call me Pip, I'm actually a woman, has enabled, you know, this lie has enabled Maya, Alison Bailey, Sonia Appleby, Kira Bell, Raquel Rosario Sanchez, 5 women I can name off the top of my head in the last 18 months, 2 years, all of whom have taken someone to court and either been successful or are going to appeal. Black women, women of colour, who are taking a lot of the flack of this movement, women in high-profile academic positions, walking around campuses or being expelled from campuses, being no platform. Someone put in the Q&A about people attacking events, physical violence at Speaker's Corner, at Women's Place events, Rosie Duffield not feeling safe to turn up to the Labour Party conference. This is not to be taken lightly. In a context where we know black girls are likely twice as likely to be excluded from school as their white counterparts, and where I think a report came out recently that said that 80% of women in prison suffer a brain injury as a result of domestic violence. So in an environment where women are already clearly, let's not forget, protected characteristic for a reason, making transgender mean the same as either transsexual or woman, I think, yeah, it's a really, really dangerous political mistake.
Okay, there's two, well, there's loads more questions actually, but there's two that I think would be useful to have your comments on. One is what's your opinion on trans men in women's spaces? And there's another one about asking for advice. This is that first one was anonymous. And another one from Kelly O'Dowd, who asks whether advice as to how to help feminist friends who don't get the importance of single-sex spaces and safeguarding, and their minds are totally closed. I mean, she puts feminist friends in inverted commas. Any advice as to how to to help these women gain the confidence to be vocal. I mean, you can read the question. It's a longer question, but they want but Kelly wants your advice, and please comment on the issue also of trans men in women's spaces. So, Marin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about female-only spaces, what we are saying is only female people should go into female-only spaces. That doesn't mean that all females must go into female-only spaces. And I'm not going to argue about your claim that how many of them are indistinguishable from all other men, because I don't really, having met quite a number of women with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, I don't believe that that is the case. And I do certainly believe that they will be more comfortable and safer in women's spaces. However, if they do choose to go into men's spaces, they put themselves at risk and no one else. And that is what we're talking about. We are talking about the exclusion of female people from spaces that they need to be female only because you're making them mixed sex. And although I have focused today on female survivors who need a female only space, we are by no means the only women who need a space like that. There are a lot of faith groups who depend on being able to use female-only spaces, such as Orthodox Jewish women, Sikh women, Muslim women. There are Christian brethren actually living around the corner from me, and these women need a female-only space. Traveller women need a female-only space, or we are excluding all of these women from public spaces. And on the issue of your claim that they are indistinguishable, what you're talking about is perception. Perception is highly subjective. We can't really make rules on the basis of perception, because then we could actually have an argument about things like hypervigilance. So what that means is if you have PTSD, you are most likely to be hypervigilant. So my lizard brain keeps telling me I'm in danger when I actually know I'm not in danger. It does that even with men I know who are supportive. So I may sit at the doctor's office and they suddenly have a male nurse, but I've never seen one, and I am very quietly on the inside freaking the heck out. That's someone who is obviously male, and I perceive him to be male, and my lizard brain goes into overdrive because it's identified a danger. That also happens to me with post-operative transsexuals who may pass for a lot of people. My lizard brain still just goes, that is a male person, and it tells me I'm in danger. So that's perception. Perception is subjective. You know, you might not have that problem. I do. So where do I go?
Thanks very much. Maya or Charlie, do you want to come in on either of those?
Yeah, I think what Mary said was exactly right, and that thing of a trans man is a woman with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. What does that mean? I think is really important. And this, you know, I wrote an article about this on my blog about over a year ago called The Trans Man Gotcha, because this is always brought up as a debating point to say, if you exclude trans women from women only spaces, you have to have this trans man in the women's toilets, and then they'll show you a picture of somebody who's taken testosterone for years and years and, you know, does pass or is alarming enough to women that it would be impractical for them to be in women's spaces. And so they put this as a kind of logical thing that if you exclude men who identify as women or men who with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, you must have these people who you will perceive as men because they have beards, they have, you know, a men's body, they've been taking testosterone for years, and testosterone has you know, very significant effects. So I think that's exactly right, that women's space is for women only, but that doesn't mean it's going to be suitable for all women. And if you think about a trans man as a woman who does not want her sex to be acknowledged, then a single sex service for women is often not going to be appropriate for her. Sometimes it will, because, you know, if that single sex service is a maternity service and this person is a trans man who is pregnant, they clearly should have equal access to maternity services, you know, to everything to do with a woman's body and a woman's health that they need in order for them to, you know, to be cared for safely. But when it comes to a public space where, you know, people are accessing it like a changing room or a showers in the gym, the fact that somebody has taken very extensive steps to make themselves look like a man is going to mean that it's not practical for them to use those spaces. And, you know, the practical answer is, in those situations, don't make everyone choose. Have other options, have unisex options, so that people who, you know, where there are no questions asked, you're on your own, you have privacy, the question of what your sex is no one else's business, and everyone can access the swimming pool without undermining each other's privacy or their own. And then in women's refuges, you know, as Marin said, they don't have to include every female person. There was something else I wanted to say about that, which
come back to you. Come back.
Yes, that's gone. But you know, I don't think this is a real, the way it's put to us is not real. It's put to us as a way of, another way of undermining female boundaries. By, you know, by saying, well, you have to accept these men with beards. Oh, I know what it was I was going to say. And if you think about sport, trans men who take testosterone are doping. They are excluded from women's sport because even though they're women, they cannot compete fairly with women who have not taken testosterone in those sports. So, you know, if you make a decision in your life that you're going to be happier by doing these things, there will be consequences of that, which your doctors should talk through with you before you do them. But, you know, you simply can't take huge amounts of testosterone and continue to compete in women's sports. But that doesn't mean that a girl in a school who says, I'm a boy, should be excluded from that school, because physically, you know, in every sense, that girl is still a girl.
Thank you.
Can I say something quickly?
You can. Come to you, yes.
I think in response to, I can't remember who, was it Kelly who asked the question about her friends? I think, you know, that question, you certainly will not be the only person who's experienced that. I think most people in this room have had conversations with people they care deeply about, with whom there seems to be intractable distance on this issue. One, I think it's extraordinary to me how the premise of female-only spaces being some kind of emergency service or requirement in particular circumstances is so normalised. We all assume, I think it is pretty well embedded in my psyche that you only need to be in a women-only space in particular moments for particular reasons, and they're usually either health related or some sort of recuperatory, repair damage space. Well, actually, I just really enjoy being in a women-only space. Am I allowed that? What if I haven't got a trauma or crisis to deal with? Am I then not allowed to be in a space just with other women? God forbid it be to have some intellectual or political or other notion. So I think it is really important to keep that in mind. Because I get very few female-only spaces, actually. The bus is not a female-only space. Very few places that I go are female-only. And I think Maya perhaps alluded to it. By the time a woman is, to all intents and purposes, physically presenting to such an extent that it's impossible to tell she's no longer female, I might be deluding myself at this point, but I think that person's desire to enter a women's only space is going to be pretty limited, because they've gone to quite extreme lengths to be perceived, accepted, validated as men. So I think it would be quite rare that in the kind of specialist single sex services we're discussing, although I'm sure it's possible. But this is where I think, and this is really perhaps controversial and dangerous, and I don't know enough about this to be sure, but I think there is a paraphilia that is worthy of mention and recognition, autogynephilia, which I think, and I might be exposing huge ignorance here, affects men. And I have never come across it. I've never come across women being spoken about in terms of autogynephilia, precisely because the gyne bit doesn't necessarily apply to women, because we already have it. So I think there is I was going to say drive then, but I stopped myself for Freudian reasons, perhaps. There is a motivating factor in some men's fascination, desire, need, expression of what they perceive to be a feminine or female identity. That is very different to that of women. And that the rationale behind wanting to be in a single sex spaces therefore might in some cases be quite distinct for men, males and females.
Thank you. By the way, Una Jane Whitfield says that she never refers to trans women. She says male gender dysphoria sufferer. I like Marin's phrase as well. There's two more, well, there's several more terrific comments and some questions as well. One, Selina Todd, well, it's a kind of question and comment, but notingly hostility and slurs that feminists face from much of the left. She asked how the panel thinks we can best make the case for our feminism, which isn't about alliances with the right, but is instead a materialist project for liberation and open to debate and argument, as much as second wave feminism was, and absolutely spot on question. So I think all three of you might like to comment on that. And whilst you're thinking about that, there's another one that I think is very pertinent as well, which basically asks you all what you think of the changes to safeguarding policy and the girl guides around this issue and its potential impact. I know Marin wants to answer that. So can you take those two? And Marin, do you want to start on the girl guides one?
I'll start.
Or both of them as well.
Okay, I'll start on the girl guides one. It's very concerning when you look at the girl guides policy for a number of reasons. The most important one for me as a parent is that they are not actually keeping parents informed. So if I send my girls, I don't have girls, but if I was to send my girls to girl guides because I particularly value a space where girls can be just with girls, and we all know, as Charlie said earlier, there is value in a space that is free from boys when you're a girl. And I'm not actually being told that there might be boys there. That has led to various situations where girls have gotten very upset because there's a boy in that space and they don't understand. They're told, well, actually, that's not a boy, that's a girl. So girl guides is actually actively deceiving both parents and girls in the way they're handling this. There is a problem for girl guides legally. They actually went to court to defend the right to be single sex. And they won that case because the Equality Act allows for associations to be single sex. However, you can only operate a single sex exception legally if you actually operate it consistently. Once you let one male child in who does not have a gender recognition certificate, because that isn't possible under UK law, you actually would have to let in every boy who says, yeah, I identify as a boy, I still want to come in, because you're letting those other boys in, because that is now discrimination on the basis of sex. I mean, this isn't something that's going to really be a case, because there's not going to be a boy who's going to sue the Girl Guides, but they are on very shaky grounds legally. On safeguarding, I would have to say that there have been, maybe the panel can help me out. Was it Helen Watts who highlighted the problems with the Girl Guides? I can't remember right now, but there are very brave leaders of the Guides who try to highlight the issues with safeguarding. And Girl Guides did the thing that is really dangerous for any organisation that deals with children, that is responsible for safeguarding children. They either managed out leaders who raised concerns, or they just kicked them out, and publicly signalled their willingness to completely undermine safeguarding. And something like that sends up a bat signal to predators. If you publicly say that you are now trans inclusive, whatever, and you're willing to completely undermine safeguarding by actively lying to parents about whether or not there will be a male guide leader there, you are signaling to people that actually might be worth having a go and seeing if I can access a victim there. And this isn't news. If you talk to safeguarding experts, they will tell you that this is what happens in organizations that signal that they're willing to look away. So this is really concerning, that parents aren't kept informed, that girls aren't kept informed, that girls are actively being deceived, and that Girl Guides is publicly denying that there's anything wrong with it. I would like them to just maybe think about what signal that also sends to the girls who come to them, to really, widen their horizons, find out that there are things that they're being told that are only for boys that actually aren't. You can enjoy that when you're a girl. It's all about self-esteem for girls. And I don't think including boys and telling girls that they're wrong in seeing a boy is going to be good for any girl's self-esteem. As for Selena's question, now I find that really difficult, because I'm traditionally left-wing, and I found it distinctly uncomfortable that the best allies that there seem to be around in Scotland for us are conservative MSPs. Now, I've never met any politicians before I became interested in this, so it was quite an education to actually find out that public personas on Twitter and the real person are not the same thing. And I was also quite surprised at the amount of understanding they can have about the issue, although they might not in Parliament be talking about it. So that is a problem for me personally. For Women Scotland is decidedly not party political at all. And I think they are right to be, because trans rights organizations talk to everyone too. They, if you look at the States, trans rights organizations fund the Republicans and they fund the Democrats. And they will talk to anybody, and they will talk to anybody in Scotland and anybody in the UK. And I think we need to find a way to maybe differentiate ourselves and not forget that if you do have, as I do, a Marxist and very structural analysis of women's oppression and male violence, that the people you're standing right next to may not share that analysis, and that maybe your policy aims going beyond campaigning against self-ID might not be the same. But then, I'm almost 50, and I'm not quite that naive anymore, that I'm thinking that if you agree with me on this, you're going to have to agree with me on everything else. So I think that plurality of opinion is something I want to live and respect. And so I am willing to talk to anybody about this and see where that gets me on a case-to-case basis, which is something, you know, that the EHRC seems very keen on. So I'll do that on a case-to-case basis. But I'm not going to say that I don't want to stand with entire sections of the public.
Thank you. Maya, do you want to come in on?
Yes, I agree on Girl Guides, and Scouts is the same. I mean, Scouts is a co-education organisation, so it can incorporate boys and girls, but it is also doing the same thing in terms of taking children and enrolling them as if they were the opposite sex, and lying to parents and lying to other children and keeping secrets with children, which all break safeguarding. It's very stark in Guides because it's a single sex organisation in theory, but it's also true in every youth organisation that's adopted gender ideology. And I think what it shows is that there is a tension between the principles of equality law and the principles of safeguarding, and they're both valuable things. We need both of them in different domains of society. The principle of equality law on sex is that you know, both being female and being male are protected characteristics. There's nothing in the Equality Act that, I mean, there are things about pregnancy, but on sex, there's nothing that says women have more protection than men, or that men are dangerous, or, you know, none of that is written into the Equality Act. But organizations can do risk assessment. They can take those things into account when they think about, do we need a single sex space for women or for men, or, you know, or both. So the Equality Act has this kind of mirror image. It doesn't include the risk assessment in relation to sex kind of wired into the Equality Act. And it also has this principle of fairness to individuals. So, you know, in equality terms, it is wrong to say this group is a risk and therefore I'm going to discriminate against you as an individual because you're from a risky group. But in safeguarding terms, it's absolutely right to say that, to say, you know, if we allow men, and I don't mean men with protected characteristic of gender assignment, just men in general, into women's changing rooms, some of them will, you know, be creeps, some of them will expose themselves, some of them will assault women, and therefore we're going to keep all men out of those spaces, even the nice ones. We're going to discriminate against them. But that's what that's the way safeguarding works, which is different from how equality works. You don't say, you know, we know that, you know, more men than women want to be soldiers, therefore we're going to exclude women from the army. You know, that, you know, the principles of the thing are different, and they have explicitly used the principles of equality law as a battering ram for safeguarding. And there should have been places where the institution said, no, it's not that we're saying equality is not a good thing, but this is not a domain where you use equality law to undermine safeguarding. Safeguarding comes first, and it has to come first in organisations looking after vulnerable people and children. And then the Gender Recognition Act goes further. It makes lying about someone's sex institutionalized, and that again breaks safeguarding. And of course, it's not just people who have a gender recognition certificate who then claim this right to require other people to lie about their sex. It's anyone who identifies as trans. So, you know, I think we have to be clearer about the tensions between equality and safeguarding, and that both are valuable, but that there are domains for each. And I was just going to say, on the other thing on guides is, it's not, I've looked at the law side of it quite a lot, and it's not quite right. They're not a service. They're not a business or a public service. What they are is an association. And the laws about discrimination in association are different from the laws about discrimination as a service, because anyone can form an association of any group. And so I wrote to EHRC about this and said, you know, why are you allowing guides to do this? They said, well, you can have an association of two different groups. For example, you can have an LGBT group, which is an association of women with the protected characteristic of same-sex sexual orientation, men with the protected characteristic of same-sex sexual orientation, and people who don't have that characteristic but have the characteristic of gender reassignment. And if those people all together want to be in an association, there's nothing to stop them. But what guides did is it took an association which was already just for girls and women, and which had a royal charter and a charitable objects which said that. And instead of saying, we're now going to allow in another group, and that group is males with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and we're going to be trans inclusive, we're going to deal with these two groups together, but we understand they're two different groups. They didn't do that. What they did was say, we're still a women's only group organization, we're still single sex, trans girls are girls, and therefore we're going to treat them as girls. Therefore we cannot write down on any risk assessment that we have a boy in the tent. We cannot tell parents that we have a boy in the troop, you know, and that includes Muslim parents, Sikh parents, you know, parents who are sending their girls to, you know, often one of the few places that they feel they can, you know, access activities, because specifically because it's a single sex service, and they're lying to those parents and breaking the trust with them. And I think that is unforgivable. And I think the Charity Commission should have done something, and they didn't, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission should have done something, and they didn't. And the safeguarding aspects of this are the most disturbing part of it, and it will be a scandal which will break at some point.
Thanks very much. Charlie, do you want to come back on Selena's question?
Yes, Selena's question's about right-wing conservative. I think there are a lot of, I don't know if this is the right word, but I think straw men, like false accusations and false premises that are bandied about. And I think it's a shame we're not in a real life setting where we can actually have a conversation, because I think another one is the kind of, you know, you're right-wing conservatives, you're funded by the Christian church, and this is the same as homosexuality in Section 28. I think in terms of right-wing conservatism, I think there is a huge difference between a collective group fighting for a struggle for collective liberation and the rights of an individual to express an individual identity. I think they are different things, and I think the irony is, actually, in my experience, gender identity ideology is one of the most right-wing authoritarian ideologies I've come across for a long time, because it is absolutely rigid in its application of gender norms and expectations, and what a girl looks like, talks like, feels like, sounds like, and what a boy looks, feels, sounds, walks, talks like. And I think those things are extremely fixed, and to me that is very conservative and authoritarian, dogmatic, and kind of stuck. And I see that as totally anti, for want of other things, Marxist certainly, but I find it the deplatforming, the refusal to debate, the use of threats and violence very quickly, the closing down of conversations. They're not open, libertarian, left-wing, far from dialectic, evolutionary conversations that lead to new thinking or the formulation of new understandings between groups. trying to struggle with oppressive practices, structures and systems. And I think, you know, there is a comment and a question about discriminatory languages tonight and trans people being oppressed. And, you know, I think lots of people in this room might describe themselves as Marxist. I don't think I'm well versed in Marxism enough. I think what I would say is, to my mind, social constructs of race, class and gender are the axes of oppression. And whilst I think there are transsexual people who experience sometimes horrific and totally unwarranted discrimination, do I think that's the same thing? Absolutely not. No, I don't. And I think that's a really important distinction. And I think that's why the experience of gender transition and reassignment is a protected characteristic.
Well, we're coming to the end, I think, and that there's so many really good comments and questions on one one from an anonymous attendee, which I'm not sure we're going to have time to answer, but on looking at how capitalism plays a pivotal role in industry and its goal to colonize female biology for corporate profit. And gender identity, this anonymous attendee says, is an industry, not a civil rights movement. It's patriarchy emblazoned in imperial form. That's a quote from Heather Bunskill-Evans. I think that this person would have liked your comments on this, but I'm not sure we've got time, because I want to give you all the chance just to say a few closing remarks. And I know we want to finish at 9 o'clock. And I'm really pleased that people have stayed right to the end of this. I think it's been fascinating, and that's why people have stayed, because we've got such good speakers. So I'm going to ask each of you then to go for your closing remarks. I'm going to do it in what sort of order? Oh, Marin, I can see you first. Would you a few closing remarks from you, then Charlie, then Maya?
Actually, I'm going to start with echoing what Charlie said and saying I do actually wish we could have a conversation right now. Because when we do have meetings in Scotland, we generally hit the pub afterwards and have the best of discussions. And it's sometimes we just assume that people know and they understand what you're talking about. And after 4 years of being completely obsessed, as people in my life would say, with this issue, I've got an encyclopedia of things in my head. And if you're new to this, a lot of it can sound actually extreme, radicalized, especially if you are still at the position where you want to be kind to everyone, which is something which is really a question that was my Charlie's dilemma, really, where I had to think about who do I want to be kind to, and I've decided I want to be kind to women, and that doesn't mean I want to be unkind to other people, but it means I prioritize the needs of women. And I would like our organizations funded to meet the needs of women to prioritize us again too.
Thank you very much. Charlie?
Thanks. I think, Marin, I agree. And, you know, who is being kind to women? And if men with a protected characteristic of gender reassignment feel unsafe in the men's bathroom, why is that? And why is it incumbent upon women to open our arms, our spaces, our minds, our political, ideological analyses to accept that men are a threat to not only women, but also other men? what does that say about men? That, I don't think that's fair or reasonable, or certainly a good enough understanding. And someone put in questions about the class struggle. Well, I mean, yeah, great. Let's talk about the class struggle. Who's in this? For what reasons? To what ends? And who's benefiting how? And why are women's spaces what we're debating? How is that possible? When actually, if men with a protected characteristic felt safe in men's spaces, we could have probably spent the last 2 hours thinking about arts and creative activity and making poetry together. And yeah, keep coming to events like this. I think I've learned so much, and men with protected characteristic, that's a life changer. Like, and all the audience members, you know, whether we agree or not, I think being able to have even an online chat and debate where we say things that are contentious or difficult or uncomfortable, that's how we learn and think together. Thank you so much. And to James, thanks for sticking around. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlie. Maya.
Yes, thank you so much for having me and for holding this meeting. I don't know how many other political parties are able to hold a meeting like this. I think it, you know, it needs to happen across the political spectrum. Sort of in belated answer to Selina's question, I'm one of those pragmatic, talk to anyone people, hence why I'm here. I'm not a communist. I am a materialist. Underlying all of this, I think, is the ability to talk about material reality, and everything else stacks on top of that. And so we will have things in common with people that we disagree on almost everything else, but we need to have common language to talk about those disagreements and to understand material reality. Sex Matters is a non-partisan organisation, and we are focused on that kind of lowest common denominator of clear language, of using the Equality Act to protect everyone's rights, and of talking to anybody and everybody. So yes, I'm really thankful to have been here, and I would definitely come back when we can go to the pub.
Well, I want to, the most frustrating thing for this meeting for me has been that I've had to chair it and not participate. So it's been very hard to keep my mouth shut. But I just have been delighted to hear what the speakers have had to say, because it's been, I think, a fantastic meeting. And if we were actually here in person, I think everybody would be going like this, clapping wildly and wanting more. I certainly hope that we can continue this discussion, but I am going to abuse my chair, my position in the chair just for 1 minute, and that is to say that Marxists are materialists, so we share that absolutely with you, Maya, that is for sure. And I think that when I said at the very beginning that we're one of the few organisations in the labour movement that's got, I think, a proper policy and analysis which understands women's oppression and why this subject is so important, that I think presents a challenge for all of us, because we do have to, and this is a response partly to the first question about what trade unions do, and partly about Selina's question. It is up to us, with, I think, the most sophisticated understanding, which has been evidenced in this meeting, to take this into a labour movement which has been itself the victim of policy capture on this issue. Policy capture in every single union and in the Labour Party and in a number of left organisations. So Selina's question is absolutely valid, and so is the first question of what trade unions can do. But my answer, and probably on behalf of the Communist Party, is that life is a struggle. We do not give up on those organisations. We fight, and we dare to struggle, and we dare to win. And with that, thank you so much for attending. And I think the participation of all of you who I can't see, none of us can see, has been great, really great. And thank you for coming. This has been recorded, and it's also been live streamed. It's also on Facebook, and I'm quite sure there will be thousands more that will watch this, see it, agree with it and be stimulated by it. And even if they don't agree with everything, nevertheless, as Charlie said, the discussion is vital, and the discussion held in the kind of context that we're holding it in now. So Marin Smith, Charlie Weinberg, Maya Forstater, thank you so, so much. The contributions have been great, and I hope that we can all come back again and we can celebrate some victories. So we need an update on your case, Maya, so we shall invite you back. And Marin, the same with you as well. And Charlie, wish you luck in combating policy capture in the sector that you work in. So bye-bye, everybody, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Shall we leave?